Oh yeah, that's just...
And how did it leave him empowered? Because I mean that's...
You know what, I can't really explain that. I can't really explain that. There was this point where he just switched.
Right.
I did, I said a whole bunch of things that were instinctively what I thought was the right thing to say.
Yeah.
And, I was absolutely non-judgmental.
Yeah.
And there was just a point where he started talking about new possibilities, and I hadn't even mentioned the word about it.
Yeah.
I think that links into what I was going to say, because I think that the real power of 360 feedback is that it does actually put people back in power,
right.
or in a sort of an empowered position, in the sense that it brings into the open stuff that is being thought about or talked about, but not to that person, because 360 doesn't create issues, it just gives the person awareness of what's being thought and said, which ultimately is a powerful, much more powerful place to be in than all this stuff going on without you knowing it.
It puts a searchlight on behaviours that otherwise they're the elephant in the room. And very often I've fed back to people who said, why don't people tell me this? Why is nobody telling me this all the time? And when you're talking to somebody who's an executive or a senior executive, well, don't forget where you are in the organisation. People are not going to come into your office and say, by the way, do you know what you're like to work with every day? Do you know what it feels like to be with somebody who's this demanding or has these high expectations or whatever it may be? They're not going to come and do that. But 360, if it's done well and done honestly, is that vehicle that allows people to feed that back through to them. And it is quite, I just believe empowering to the individual.
I think it is different. If we're talking about doing it with individual cases of senior managers, I think that's very much the case. And it is that thing, isn't it, that when you're young and junior in your career, everyone gives you feedback all the time and tells you when you're being a twat, and as you get more senior, but that's what leads to derailment, because there's sort of aspects of your personality or behaviour that, perhaps would have gone checked as a younger person become more and more extreme because your thermostat is not getting any feedback into it, so there's no self-regulation. I think when you use 360 more holistically across an organisation, what you hope it might do is actually create a culture where in the future that won't happen, where there is more of a norm of feedback, so that you're actually trying to change the rules and norms around feedback within an organisation so that it becomes easier for people to just give and receive feedback.
Ideally, you end up with an organisation which is a self-fulfilling 360 all the time, and people are giving that kind of feedback to individuals. But it takes a long way with most cultures. I mean, some organisations I've got into are fairly close. They have good conversations. They have those kind of discussions. Others, taking the 360 step is huge. The thought of actually getting that kind of feedback from people is scary. But once they start doing it, they can see the value in this. And I always say to clients, I'm sure everybody else does, 360 is merely the start of a process, not the end. This is you opening the door and saying to people, give me the feedback, I want it, I can use it. It's of great value to me.
Well, of course, and that leads into some of the problems, because I think there are quite a lot of people now, because 360 has been around for a while, where there is a potential legacy where 360 has just been the end. It's been done, people get feedback sessions, it's a sort of thing that's institutionalised and people go through it, but it hasn't been very useful. It's been a bit negative because people have seen, and there's been no support. And I think that's one of the things that we now have to undo.
Yes, because, in this case, right at the beginning of the process, there was a situation where the person having the 360 had their automatic thought was that some other people in the organisation were kind of ganging up on them, and this was going to give these people the evidence they wanted to prove a point. I can't remember the phrase that was used, but like witch hunt or something like that. It wasn't that, it was something like that.
Something vaguely threatening.
Yes, a threatening thing, and a ganging up, and part of the campaign type of thing. And one of the things I acknowledged the client for was that the client chose to participate full out and shift their perspective on that. Acknowledge that was only one possible perspective and create an empowering perspective themselves without any support before I came on the scene and before the 360 was done. So I thought that was...
Yeah, that's a big part of it, isn't it? The individual think the organisational culture, which you touched on in terms of readiness, but also the individual's readiness to accept, acknowledge, recognise, and therefore the so what that comes out as a result.
Yes.
And then linking into your point of it's the beginning too. And sometimes it can just simply be, I can recall conversations that I've had in a debrief where you kind of think, well, this was a bit all or nothing in the debrief, and you kind of think, well, okay, we did it was fine. But actually, when I've then done a loop back, it was the catalyst for internal thought processes and light bulb moments and just a bit of reflection that then led to some change sometime later on down the line. So I think it's not to, I think that's a good learning for me in terms of it doesn't always happen in the moment. I mean, some of the examples you've cited, yes. It's very visible, it's very apparent. It's not always.
Yes.
And not to underestimate the power
of
self-reflection.
Yes, absolutely.
The kind of ripple effect.
Yeah. Yes, and one of the tricky things I think for us is to really, it helps for us to really know the subtlety of that power and that effect, because people may not be conscious of it. You know, it might be happening to them, and other people might see it or might not. But it doesn't mean it's not happening. Do you know what I mean? So for us we need to understand that's possible, and then work with that.
There is another aspect to it as well that I've found in the past, is that the people who are the reportees, the people you go out to, or they go out to, suddenly think, wow, he or she really wants to know what I think about them.
We have a
Isn't
voice.
that fantastic?
Yes.
And they come to me to ask how I'm seeing their behaviours.
Yes.
And immediately it puts them in a different light as well. And they start to think about their own behaviours. I was doing this with the boss and I thought, oh God, I wonder how I am on that. And all of a sudden they're starting to think about themselves. So that's a knock-on effect that we don't often see.
Yes, no, you're quite right. And actually there's probably a very subtle benefit also just of them expressing themselves, actually, in the moment. Yeah. In the moment they've said everything really that they can say about this individual, and while that, until something else happens with that person, there's probably a clarity of relationship, probably.
Well, I think that very much links into one of the questions that you posed around qualitative feedback, because I believe very strongly that that's key to the process. I think if you don't have that, reviewers probably don't feel that they can say everything that they want to say.
Yes.
And my experience is that it's often the qualitative comments that hold the most power. Apart from very extreme cases like your man, where the numerical scores are very stark, it's quite easy, isn't it? I mean, receiving 360 feedback reports go, okay, so I got a 3.2 on organises own time efficiently compared to a 3.8. Doesn't really mean that much, does it? I mean, clearly people think you could do it a bit better, but that's not a hugely powerful. I mean, in terms of the sort of leverage to change, it doesn't create huge leverage. And often scores are quite high, so people tend not to. There's a 5-point rating scale, if the score's over 3, they sort of think, okay, well, it's all right, it's not like that. But it's when you get someone, giving feedback in their own words, those are the things that we really see.
And their interpretation.
And what they notice about those,
of work, the example that you use, my take on what that means for this person is going to be somewhat different to somebody else's, and being able to just articulate that. Or at least provide the opportunity, I think that's the key.
Yes, it's the opportunity to say.
I think it's really important for both parties.
Yes.
I used to find it quite frustrating when if somebody had scored in using the 1-5 scale, somebody scored at a 1 or a 5, and they've not bothered then to put a comment in around that. So you're feeding back to somebody who said, well, you've got this feedback here, you've got this score here, and somebody said you're well below the average they would expect to see a leader, but we don't know why. Because they've not bothered to back that up with a comment. And of course the risk was always, we had this discussion when I was setting up the 360, if you say to somebody, you must give a qualitative comment for a 1 or a 5 score, then they're going to score 3, because that gets them out of putting a comment in. But you're absolutely right, and it's those comments which really make the difference, because they will encapsulate the very behaviour that the people are either showing as a great strength or as a potential weakness. And so, they do make a huge difference.
There was something in the paper that I thought it didn't quite capture it, and I just wanted to sort of ask the question in terms of thoughts. and that is in terms of the respondents contributing to the feedback. What are your thoughts and experiences around then the individual who's receiving the feedback to then go back to those respondents? And almost that's part of the development journey. I'm just thinking of
Can I put that down as one of the critical process steps, because that is definitely worth.
It's what happens after in terms of the target and their respondents.
They must feedback.
Yeah, and I guess an obligation,
Yeah.
because it's part of the ongoing development plan, is the way I debriefed and discussed, and the formality and courtesy.
Yeah, let's come to that, because that's a bit
Yes,
more
it's
of
yeah. But otherwise, it also is the elephant in the room. The leader goes back, and everyone knows they've had their 360.
No one
and nothing's ever said. And everyone's sort of going,
And they never
does it have
thank.
their feedback? And then everything. So I always say,
And
at the
that's
very least,
the most
that's what I
positive
just say. At
thing.
the very least, please go back and say, thank you. I had the
Have the
feedback. It was
feedback.
helpful. Thank you.
You're all fired.
That's the minimum. Because
It's all got bonus.
otherwise, it's awful. There's a sort of, it creates a new strange elephant in the room when they go back.
Yep.
Any other aspects of value? Andrew?
I think we might be heading where I was kind of thinking the question why, and you've been doing 360s for a whole lot longer than I've been considering them. For me, it's throws up why 360. It's kind of like there's a deficiency in open and honest conversation. Okay, so for me, I remember when I was working with you to create the one that we created, it was about some way that the logical professional mind works. It's like, oh, here's justification for not having an open, honest conversation or relationship with the people around me. It's a great way in is to be given some mathematical or point-driven, It's like, okay, so now we can actually have a conversation. So I don't know where I'm kind of going with that, but it's 360 is a way in for whatever to that.
Yes.
And and it may be that it sort of highlights that in its data as well.
Highlights deficiency, probably.
And deficiency isn't the right word.
It creates a permission to do something that's not being.
It's almost taking a step back to principles of feedback, isn't it?
Yes.
So if you kind of just say 360 as a vehicle, a tool to facilitate that, then absolutely, it's almost where's the culture of an organisation, whether it be individual teams, of course, in that exchange and that readiness to exchange, but not just to give, but also when you're on the receiving end and the behaviours that go with that, and of course good and bad. It's acknowledging the good, and how many times when you're receiving a compliment you just sort of bashfully
brush it and
absolutely, and think, okay, on to the next thing, and I just want to be critiqued, but actually I don't know how to receive criticism either. So it's all of that precursor stuff, maybe not deficiency.
Sorry, deficiency is the wrong word. It can be a tool for improving conversations.
Yes.
But it's definitely a strong, just my experience of coming from an organisation which actually had a feedback culture, and that it was actively encouraged that after you went to the meeting, if you went to a meeting with a colleague, you get feedback on how you did and all this kind of thing. And it was very interesting because it didn't come from any consistent structure. It was just, you knew that this is what you were expected to do, and everyone was sort of left to their own devices as to how you went about doing it. It's actually really difficult to live in that environment, and it actually, I would say, it was always a positive thing, because it could be quite political, and so it's just very interesting to then, for me, to then get to know about 360 and to see it done in a consistent way. In a way that provided a format for people to consider the right sorts of things and to frame it in even just a really standard stop-start continue sort of thing, but to make sure that there's a positive and it's something that needs to stop, and then so that it's framed correctly, and then that will then inform a correct culture of feedback throughout the organisation. But it's for me, it's that. That's one of the things I'm interested in, is creating 9 good processes that then teach people a good way of having good conversation.
Interesting thing you just hit on there as well, which I'd like to I know you're going to look at next time, I think, is what you're basing the 360 on. So that choice of, are we using a set of competencies, and I've had that experience, and it's, I think it's death by 360, 144 competencies rated between 1 and 7, away you go. You can imagine how the respondents feel. But is it, what behaviours are we using? What organisational culture are we using?
How relevant is this?
How relevant is it to the individual, and how relevant is it to the organisation?
Absolutely.
And one of the things I really enjoyed when I worked with talent relations, when we developed a 360, was we allowed people to put in 2 questions themselves. So the individual raters could say, you know, I believe this is